going on in Parliament today. It's Thursday afternoon, and it's the time of the month when the Conservatives have to release the pressure valve. Let all the backbench off the chain, let them run around, howl at the moon, pound their chests, light the big bonfire, and throw red meat to their base. So today, if you're watching, we are now back in the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is a place the Conservatives love to be. You know, those were glory days for the Conservatives, right? So the fact that the world has moved on, they're a little lost, they need something. So this is their day to bring an issue of great importance to Canadians. So for folks back home, all Parliament stops today. So the Conservatives can bring forward a motion. It's a right of the opposition, New Democrats do it, to have a debate on an issue of substance. So folks back home that I represent, well, they would probably want to talk about the pension crisis. That would be a good debate here. The fact that many families that I represent don't have doctors. Now, a lot of that's provincial, but with the health accord and the transfers, that would be a debate we could have here. There are people who are deeply concerned about the brutal bombing in Aleppo. What role could Canada play? That would be a matter for debate in the House. But the debate today is the Conservatives figure they got a gotcha moment on the Prime Minister, and so they will have a special debate to refight the Cold War in order to try and embarrass the Prime Minister of this country. I will be sharing my time with the member from Esquimalt Saanich-Sooke, Mr. Speaker, by the way. Now, personally, it's not my job to get up here and defend the Prime Minister on any given day, although people on the other side would probably know I'm always more than fair and more than reasonable and more than willing to bend myself into pretzels to actually understand some of the inane comments I've heard. But I'm not going to lose any sleep over his comments on Mr. Castro. I was actually just thinking, as we listened to them invoking Marco Rubio, of all people, that we should be outraged. You know, I don't know, Mr. Speaker. I may classify myself as one of the few Canadians who's actually never visited Cuba. Everybody else I know goes to Cuba all the time. They tell me about the Havana nightlife, the great people, but the Conservatives would make it think that you're flying into some kind of death camp. The only reason I haven't visited Cuba is because I don't do warm climate very well, being a northern boy. But I was listening to them invoking Marco Rubio, of all people. If Marco Rubio's upset, Canadian people should be upset. And I was thinking, one of the statements that was made on the day of Castro's death was, upon receiving the sad news of his death, I expressed my sentiments of sorrow to the family members of Mr. Castro. That's the Pope. Pope Francis didn't mind saying something nice about the guy. So, you know, if Pope Francis says something nice about the guy, let him rest in peace. Because you know why, Mr. Speaker? We've got more important things to talk about here than the legacy of Castro and the Bay of Pigs and the legacy of the Cold War. We have issues that have to be dealt with. So if we're going to get to whether or not the Prime Minister should have said a little more on this way or a little more that way, I'm not the kind of guy that loses too much sleep over a Prime Minister or a politician speaking off the top of the head if they're in front of a mic 24 hours a day. They're going to say some stuff that's going to get called out. That's fair play. I'm more interested that when you make a statement that's supposed to mean something and you don't actually live up to it, that's where I think debate should be happening. For example, I remember the Prime Minister, when he was in the third party, saying 2015 will be the last election of the first past the post system. He wasn't equivocating. He was as clear as could be. But now we're seeing, what are they talking about? That all the work of the all-party committee that was told by this Prime Minister to go across the country, the work was too rushed, too radical, unnecessarily hasty. And then we had the disgrace in the House this afternoon of the Minister of Democratic Reform insulting the work of politicians and Canadians who participated in those hearings, saying they didn't work hard enough. That's what I'd hold this Prime Minister to account for. Because we have a tradition in this House, Mr. Speaker. It's about sort of this old gentleman's club, and I know that we have women and now there's gentle women. But you know, it's very unparliamentary to ever accuse someone of lying. You could never do that. But it seems perfectly parliamentary to lie, because you'll just say, well, the member maybe misunderstood me. But we need to call the Prime Minister out on promises that he made, that he told people he would keep, and he had no intention of keeping, for example, on democratic reform. On cash to access, the fact that I see the Prime Minister's mandate letter to his ministers, not just to follow the law, but to go above it, and that they were under the Conflict of Interest Act. And now they're saying, well, you know what, every other party's done it, and far be it, for all the years I've been in Parliament, that nobody on the Conservative side ever said I took their side once. But you know what? When Bev Oda tried a cash for access scheme, she gave the money back. The Conservatives knew it was wrong, and they gave the money back. This government seems to believe that it might be the finance minister. I got to understand, maybe he believes that actually being in a billionaire's living room and getting paid $1,500 to him might be democratic consulting. That might be, you know, maybe it's just the way he thinks. You know, and God forbid for me to say great things about Jim Flaherty. Man, Jim Flaherty and I went at like brass knuckles. But Jim Flaherty was a Democrat. He knew what meeting people was about. We disagreed on a lot of stuff. But Jim Flaherty didn't need to raise his money sitting in a corporate boardroom with 6 or 12 friends and you pay them $1,500. There's something wrong about that, because that's about cynicism and it makes people cynical. So when a Prime Minister promises to do better, he has to do better. I'm thinking mostly, Mr. Speaker, on what he said to the residential school survivors, and I was there, when he said, moving forward, our goal is to help lift this burden from your shoulders, from those of your families, from your communities. It is to accept fully our responsibility as government. And yet, this week, they were in court, the Justice Minister, trying to overthrow a ruling of compensation to a child survivor of sexual abuse. And the government, this government, the feminist government, said that a residential school survivor had to prove intent of an adult. There's no legal standard in the world that accepts that, except when it's applied against Indian people. Last month, the Minister of Justice tried to throw out a case that said that Ontario Superior Court called it a perverse misapplication of justice on a child who was raped in a residential school but couldn't remember the date. And the Justice Department believes they can have that case thrown out. We had the Department of Justice suppressing thousands of pages of police testimony knowingly. And when they were forced to hand over the documents, they took out the names of the perpetrators. And so a serial pedophile at St. Anne's Residential School who abused children for 40 years, a person who came forward for compensation had their case thrown out because the Department of Justice had that thrown out. And Mr. Speaker, I go back to this again and again and again, because either we have one set of law in this country or we don't. That the Justice Minister believes that they can undermine and establish a second set of rights for Indian people in this country is absolutely appalling and is a breach of all legal duty. So when I hear the Prime Minister, I was there. I teared up when the Prime Minister made that promise. I believed him. And Canadians believed him, and the residential school survivors. So if we're going to stand in this House, there's many promises this Prime Minister made, and he made them with full heart, and people trusted him. I could talk about C-51. They didn't like it. Then they were afraid not to vote for it. Then they said, don't worry, elect us and we'll change it. Nothing happened. They talked about a nation-to-nation relationship, and the Justice Minister said on Site C that it didn't meet the standards and it ran roughshod over Aboriginal title, and they approved it anyways. Your word has to mean something as a politician, Mr. Speaker. So we're having a lot of fun today, debating something that I don't think most Canadians are going to care much about tomorrow or the day after, or probably even after the debate's over. But we have issues that we need to debate in this House. And the debate has to be about how do we start talking in a way that Canadians can start to trust us. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, with all due respect for my Conservative colleagues, they're having a lot of fun. They're taking the pressure off. They're feeding red meat to their backbenchers. They're howling at the moon. They're jumping up and down. They're beating their chests. They're denouncing the Reds, the commies. In fact, I haven't been called a Bolshevik yet, but I'm sure that's coming too. But that's all right. And meanwhile, we'll get back to work. Yes, I'll be taking numbers on that one. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.